Great to be with you. We're talking today about a topic that I have been interested in this, and you've heard me do some similar forums, not exactly this, but similar topic in the past. We are living in an age where, as our theme for Easter says, a life reimagined. And as Christians, I think it's no secret that we're trying to kind of reimagine how it is to be the church today, as we watch so many things change around us and try to just kind of figure out who we are and where God is calling us to be. And so Ann Peterson and I have put together this forum today to talk about, I'm going to talk about kind of the 150,000 foot level, do some kind of historic stuff, like stratosphere stuff, and have us do some personal reflection as well. And then Ann is going to talk more about how these changes that are happening and the societal things are really impacting the ELCA, as her role as the Vice President of the Southeastern Minnesota Synod. And she'll say more about that. But we are in this era where, you know, we don't sit necessarily in the same pew, no pun intended, although I know Noel and Ann have become good at that, not sitting in the same pew over the last few years. But we're just looking at these spiritual trends. So I want us to just think personally for a few minutes to get us started. And for some this may be easier than others, but I want you to imagine that it is 1970. Now, I will admit, I was not alive in 1970. I know. This is cruel. They're already booing, and we've only been at this for 3 minutes. So I'm going to imagine what church was like for me as a child. I would like you to imagine, if 1970 is too far back in your memory, or didn't exist, imagine what it was like as a child. But imagine it's 1970. And now think about who lived in your household at that time. You don't have to say anything, but just imagine, paint that picture. How many hours a week did you work outside the home? Okay. How many weeks of vacation did you take a year back in 1970? And if you had children at the time, how did they spend their time after school? Okay, got those things in your head? Anyone want to just give us a quick picture of what life for you looked like in 1970 at this time? How many of you had children in 1970 at home? And how did they spend their time after school?
Playing with their friends.
Playing with kids in the neighborhood,
Yeah.
right? Riding their bikes. They're outside just, yeah. And how many of you worked outside the home in 1970? Okay. Full-time, part-time? Full-time. Okay. Did you work more hours in 1970 than maybe you did in 1990? No. No. Okay. So let me paint a sociological picture. This is what's happened, and for some reason the display up here and what's on my screen here, it's cutting off the bottom, so I apologize for that. Here's what's going on. In 1970, people were working, on average, 35 hours a week. On average. That was the average worker worked 35 hours a week. In 2012, the average worker worked 46 hours a week. That's a day and a half more a week, basically, than they did in 1970. And the average household income, adjusted for inflation, was $59,000 in 1970, whereas in 2012, it was $51,000. So over the course of 42 years, that's right? Yeah. 42 years, incomes have dropped and hours of work have gone up. And it's one of the ways that we can look at and imagine how some of the societal changes are shaping and impacting the life of our congregations, the life of the church, the life of our kind of civil society, you could say, the kind of volunteer sector of our society, right? So one other graphic. In 1960, I couldn't find information for 1970, but I suspect it was not too far off from this. In 1960, 8 in 10 American children had just one working parent. And in 2012, only 3 in 10 children had a stay-at-home parent. And so the landscape of our households have changed dramatically. You know, as I grew up in the 1980s, and most of my growing up, I had at least, my parents were able to work it out where one of them only worked while I was in school, and there was always someone there in the morning, and there was always someone there when I came home from school, and most of the time, there was really no standard daycare. When my wife and I had children, the first year that we had 2 children, we spent $13,000 in childcare, because there's just no way to do it any other way, right? So it's all those hours that are not together with family. Now as I watch my kids get older, my daughter particularly, you talk about kids running around, you know, with neighbors in the backyard, and I think about how sometimes I have parents of my daughter's friends who call and say, "Can we have a play date in 2 weeks?" Because that's the next time that my son or daughter is available. My daughter's 8 and in 2nd grade, you know. So these are certainly anecdotal, but I think that it can be expanded beyond just my own experience or our own experiences here in Rochester, that there are some significant things that have changed that are going to have an impact on how we do ministry and what ministry looks like and what church looks like and why we're doing this together in the first place because of all these societal changes. Now, we can say, boy, this is doom and gloom. I don't want this to be doom and gloom, right? With our theme this Easter of Life Reimagined, I think as people of faith, we have to look at the reality of where we're at and say, what opportunities and what new things is God doing because of these things that we're being forced to confront? I think that's where I want us to attend to today. And as we look forward, as we wonder about who we are as a church, not only Zumbro, but a denomination and the religious landscape of America. One article that I read this week in the Christian Century said that today there are 1,000 fewer volunteer hours in a congregation of 100 families than there were in 1970. So 1,000 fewer hours of volunteer service. That's a full-time, or it's a half-time position, you know. And I think that's we couldn't figure out the timeline. I imagine that's per month or per quarter, not per year, because you do the math and you think about how many days a week you would spend in church, you know, when your kids were young in the 70s and 80s. It's a whole lot different than it is today. So there were, I shouldn't say Christianity, there have been 4 great moves. Like, the reality is that this is nothing really new. The church has always been a dynamic organization and organism that has ebbed and flowed and had all kinds of things happen. And there have been 4 significant moves over the course of 2,000 years that happen to take place about every 500 years, right? Guess where we're at? We're at the end of a 500-year cycle, and something's emerging, perhaps. At least there are a couple authors out there who are suggesting that there are. The first great move was this great transition, or the great transformation. It is the birth of Jesus, who transformed a Jewish faith that was one culture in one specific place into a dynamic religious movement that spread far and wide in a time where mobility was not really a huge or an easy thing to do. But over the course of the first 500 years of Christianity, because of the Roman Empire and the way in which the empire adopted Christianity, it spread, right? This huge transformation. And along with that and the rise of and strength of an empire came great academics and great innovations. And think of how the Roman armies found their way across wide swaths of land, not only doing violence but also spreading the gospel, and all the innovations that took place in those 500 years to make that happen. So that's the first great transition of Western Christianity. Come 500 years later, you could call it the Great Decline or the Dark Ages. The Dark Ages, the fall of Rome happened in the middle of the 400s, and we went from one giant empire covering huge swaths of land, a couple of continents basically, to fiefdoms and feudalism, where all of a sudden the stability of Rome is gone and everyone is vying for their own little patch of land. And it oppressed everyone who didn't have any power. It made a very few amount of people have a whole lot of power. And the academy and the church kind of just existed. The only thing that really came out of the significant thing that came out for the church during this time was monasticism, where the church really existed and thrived in little cloistered communities of monks and nuns. And that's really what kept the tradition of theology alive for 1,000 years. Come right in the middle of that, in the middle of this great decline and some crisis, was the Great Schism of the East and West Church. And this was huge. This sounds like a candidate. This was huge. A couple of candidates who used that line too often. Anyway, but in 1054, the Roman Church and the Eastern Church split over doctrine, over a little word called filioque. In the Nicene Creed, which we have been saying this Easter season. So, I can't take too much time. I did my senior thesis in college on this, so I kind of geek out about this stuff. But, so the Western Church was convinced that, or would claim, that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. Filioque is and the Son. And the Eastern Church said, absolutely not. The Son and the Holy Spirit proceed from God alone. And so we probably look at this today and go, what's the big whoop, right? I had a friend who was speaking with an Orthodox priest just a few weeks ago, and he kind of made that comment like, what's a big whoop? And the Eastern Orthodox priest was like, oh, no, you didn't. So this is still kind of a big deal. But we've made huge strides in ecumenism and healing. In fact, there's even international councils at this point talking about finding a joint shared Easter set in the calendar so that Easter is no longer a movable feast. We'll see. I don't know. Come 1,500 years after Christ, 500 years after the Great Schism, Martin Luther shows up, and you have the Great Reformation, which kind of reclaimed all the lost academia, theology. It just created this resurgence of amazing intellectual explosion in the church. It enlivened the church, it renewed the church, it also caused further division in the church, right? And so we've been living with that, and this is where we've kind of been living for the last 500 years. There's this Great Reformation, and in this tradition of this Great Reformation, which we are beneficiaries of. Who knows if any of us would be here had the Reformation not happened, right? But that was almost 500 years ago. 500 years ago next year. I kind of stated this as 2000. It's because we're kind of living in flux. The end date of that, who knows, really. But the question is, are we entering the next great? The next great something. Now, Phyllis Tickle, who is a sociologist of religion and a great writer, makes the argument that we are living into the great emergence. There is something emerging at this time that is something completely new. It is she'd even say it's a new reformation. Now, there's others who are a little skeptical about that. But we can probably, with some amount of certainty, say the division within the church is no longer the greatest challenge for the church. Our fighting amongst one another is no longer our greatest issue, right? The Pew Research Center, Pew Forum on Religion and Society put out a religious landscape survey results from last year. And between 2007 and 2014, Christians' share of the population fell almost 8% in America in 7 years. So we have evangelical Protestants are declining by 1%, Catholics are declining by 3%, mainline Protestants, that's us, 3.5%, non-Christian faiths are on the rise by 1.2%, so Hindus, Muslims, Jews, and others. This is the big one. In 7 years, unaffiliated folks rose almost 7%, so almost 1% per year grew in unaffiliated. Those are people who are saying, you know, I might be spiritual, but this religion thing, I don't think I need that, you know? So this isn't to say that unaffiliated are atheists, that people are completely giving up on God. But what is happening is that people are stepping outside of the organized institutional confines of our religious traditions. This seems to be a greater challenge to us today, maybe, than the fights within our churches, right? I do a lot of the new member stuff and visitor follow-up, and you know, we trade sheep a lot across churches, right? That's what, you know. And so for me, one of my interests is not being a sheep trader, but a sheep herder. That we actually grow the flock as a whole, and we're really comfortable trading sheep because at least there's some kind of basis of information of the same kind of, you know, people have the same background. Yeah, Rich.
Any idea in that unaffiliated group what fraction of them try to maintain a relationship with God?
It's actually quite high. The percentage of people who claim a spirituality or a belief in God has not declined at the same level. Yeah.
No, I didn't mean belief. I mean relationship.
Okay, so say more about that.
Well, you could believe in God and not, it wouldn't affect your ethic in any way at all, just believing that there's a God.
Sure.
But having a relationship with God would instill you to love your neighbor.
You would think, right? You would think. However, this same study, it was a newer study that just came out from Pew, says that the difference between those who have a faith and those who practice no faith are almost equally ethical. That people's claim of their religion does not necessarily impact the decisions they make about how they treat their neighbor, or whether they recycle and steward the earth, or whether they contribute more to financial contributions is a different thing. But yeah, I was shocked by that when I read that. And if you're interested, you can go to the pewforum.org, and really interesting stuff about that. But yeah, so I wish it were true. But I think that's why our spiritual journey is important, to attend to. And
what about prayer life?
People who are unaffiliated don't pray as much as those who, but it's still about 63%, I think. of unaffiliated folks do. So, so what's this all mean? You know, what does this mean for us then? What's emerging in the church? We could say that historically belonging equaled a communal identity that tied us to a past, right? That we were tied to a tradition, and that we are somehow working to continue that tradition in which we have planted ourselves. And that it's much more communally minded, right? I belong to the Lutheran Church, and therefore I'm going to work toward promoting a Lutheran identity and a Lutheran understanding of how we approach the world, and do that collectively. I think today, the belonging for many is tied to a communal identity that's tied to the future. That says, if I'm going to belong to this community or to this organization, I want to know what kind of difference it's going to make for the future. What difference is this going to make for my neighbor? I think it goes to this question. That's one of the big moves that's happened as societies become more and more cosmopolitan, more urban, and less rural. That's where there's often a split as well. And so as we become more, as we seek any kind of communal identity, which I think is countercultural in itself today because we live in a pretty individualistic society, that communal identity is tied to a shared future that's hopeful and hopefully better than what it is today. Historically, we would say, in the last 500 years, the church has been the center of life, of culture, of society. Literally, physically, the church is often in the center of the town. We are a downtown church. I don't know if we've ever articulated exactly what that means. I think we've been trying to figure that out, but I wonder if some of our subconscious as a congregation here at Zumbro is that as a downtown church, we're still in the center of things, and that should make a difference for how we engage the community around us, even as it changes. But that's not a judgment, it's just an observation. It's a wondering that I have, and why there's a Presbyterian and a Methodist and a Catholic, that the main line and the Catholics have stayed downtown because that's where we feel comfortable, right? And I think you could say that what's emerging is that the church is an alternative or optional culture within the broader culture, that people choose much more to be part of this culture because of something they see in how they belong and what kind of difference it's going to make for the future. And then you could say spirituality and faith, there was an external expectation that you're just engaged in it, right? That everyone took Wednesday night off and everyone showed up to church to do confirmation, and there was no other events on Sunday morning, so families could worship together and they could do Sunday school together and continue. And now that expectation is gone. I don't like to point fingers, but certainly, club sports for youth, starting as young as first and second, third grade, they don't have any other time. There's only 24 hours in the day and only 7 days a week. And so they're vying for people's attention and time and trying to meet a demand. And so they have to schedule things on Wednesday nights. They have to schedule things on Sunday mornings. And so all of a sudden we are vying for the same time and attention as all those other organizations. And so our spirituality and faith, I think, is then instigated by invitation rather than some kind of external expectation. But that we become the inviters, and we become the mouthpiece, the voice for those who are looking for a communal identity and a purpose beyond themselves. So I'm going to give the rest, or a majority of time. I only went 5 minutes over. Am I okay? Am I okay? So we're going to talk.
That's 5 minutes. We don't have to talk.
Thank you. So, you probably are already figuring out that we have easily enough information for 2 Sunday morning forums, and we're trying to condense it into one. But my job is to sort of help us bring it down a little more on the ground. And the first thing I want to do is just take a couple of minutes to do a very quick ELCA 101, knowing that there probably are people in this room who did not grow up in the ELCA, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. People who didn't perhaps grow up Lutheran at all, like me. Some of you perhaps are even new, not just to ELCA, but maybe to the church. So I'm going to give you just a very brief glimpse of how the ELCA is structured, how we're put together. We sometimes use the term 3 expressions of the church in the ELCA. There are congregations, there are synods, and there's the church-wide organization, which for the last 28 years has been based in Chicago. All 3 of these expressions have a very similar structure. In congregations, there's a pastor and a synod, or a congregational council. At the synod level, there is the bishop and the synod council. And at the church-wide level, we have the presiding bishop, who now is Elizabeth Eaton, the first woman bishop in our history, and an ELCA church council. The church-wide organization is organized into 65 synods. 6 of them are in Minnesota. The word synod actually means walking together. The Southeastern Minnesota Synod is organized into 5 conferences, about 175 congregations that stretch from Fairmont on the west to the Mississippi River, and from Faribault and Red Wing in the north to the Iowa border. That's roughly our geographic area. I currently serve as the vice president. It's my 5th year serving in that role. And Pastor Jason serves on the Synod Council and also on the Executive Committee. Beginning in the fall of 2014, the Synod Council began exploring a new mission and vision that would guide our work over the next 4 years. Many members of congregations, along with Synod leaders, clergy and lay people, with members of the Synod Council and committees, participated in a visioning process that eventually led us to develop our new Synod mission. So if I click this, something will happen. Yeah, thank you. This new mission statement was just adopted this spring by the Synod Council. That our mission in the Southeastern Minnesota Synod is that we are equipping congregations and leaders to follow Jesus into a changing world. This mission statement is built around 3 initiatives or 3 strategic priorities. Those are developing leaders, equipping congregations, and accompanying our global partners. Like the other 64 synods of the ELCA across the country, our synod has faced steadily declining financial support from congregations over the last few years. Those of you that were in forum last week heard Adam Copeland talk about the changing giving patterns around the country, a difference in the way that people give to both church and church-related institutions. And in the spring of 2015, this steadily declining support meant that we had to make some very difficult decisions in our synod about how we could continue to support the ministries within the synod, as well as support our ministry partners, including Luther Seminary and Lutheran Campus Ministry Minnesota, and also provides our present level of support to the church-wide organization. Sadly, in 2015, the Synod Assembly made a painful decision to reduce the percentage of our giving to the ELCA to 48%. Without going into great detail, the dollars that the undesignated mission support that's sent from Zumbro and the other congregations in the Synod that comes into the Synod, historically in the ELCA, the pattern was that 45% of those undesignated dollars stayed in the Synod and 55% were sent to the church-wide organization in Chicago for broader global. We have struggled mightily in southeastern Minnesota to maintain that 55%, and in recent years we were able to give it pass along as much as 52%. But in 2015, we had to make that decision. The decision was made at the Synod Assembly to lower that percentage to 48%. So right now, 48% of what churches send to the Synod is sent on to Chicago. Significant cuts also had to be made in our funding for ministry partners, including Luther Seminary. And at the same time, the Synod Assembly passed a resolution to the ELCA Church Council asking them to develop a strategic plan for mission funding. And that will be presented at or anticipated at the 2016 Church-wide Assembly. That assembly will be held in New Orleans in August. I will be a voting member from our synod, as will Colo Nimley from our congregation as well. Meanwhile, back in Chicago, conversations were continuing among ELCA leaders and the church council regarding the sustainability of mission throughout the church, in congregations, at the synod level, and also church-wide. And these conversations led to the formation of something called the Future Directions Table, which is made up of bishops from around the country and members of the synod of the ELCA Church Council. There are 2 Minnesotans serving on this table. One is Dr. Alan Bieber, who is a member of People of Hope here in Rochester. He's also a member of the ELCA Church Council. And the other is Bishop John Anderson from southwestern Minnesota. Oops, sorry. I'm using my notes to help me stay on topic here. So under the leadership of presiding Bishop Eaton, the Future Directions Table has now developed something that they are describing as a communal spiritual discernment, called forward together in Christ, listening to each other and listening to the Holy Spirit to help us move forward as a church together into the future that God is planning for us. The ELCA is a very young church. We're only 28 years old. So it's a good time for us to see where we are as God's people and to see what God might have in store for us for the future. And as Pastor Jason said, we think it's an exciting time to be looking forward because we'll soon be celebrating the 500th anniversary of the Reformation in 2017. We want to create a vision for the future of the ELCA, a church with solid foundation sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ and making a difference in the world and locally. As a church, we can be proud to pass on to our children and our grandchildren. We want to discover how we can continue to faithfully serve God's mission in the years ahead and reach a shared understanding among church leaders about the ministries that are most important. We want to assess whether the structures that were set up for this church 28 years ago are still right for the future. And as part of this, consider how we can best use our resources. There are a lot of challenges. It's a big undertaking because we're trying to listen to many voices within the ELCA. People in the pews, like those of you here, existing and emerging church leaders, young adults, people of color, and people from other ethnic backgrounds. And I know here in our congregation, or even in Rochester, even in Minnesota, we don't see a great ethnic diversity in the ELCA congregations, but across the church there is a great deal of ethnic diversity, more and more all the time, and for that we are very grateful. And also we want to listen to people who are new to Christianity and new to the ELCA to see what they might have to offer us. So this morning, you have an opportunity to share in that, and I really encourage those of you in the back, if you would try to find a place at a table so that you can be part. There's a total empty table up here. There are other tables where you can fill in. It really will be helpful to us if you will come up and join this conversation. And while you're doing that, we're going to play do we have time to think? A very brief video from Bishop Eaton that will sort of invite you into this process. So while you're moving to find a spot, and if there's not a spot at a table, maybe you can just scoot your chair close by, and then we're going to come back and let you have some conversation. Because I don't think we had a film. We might have had a film strip projector at Sunday school. I don't think we had a film projector, I'm pretty sure. So we certainly didn't have yeah, Martin Luther would have had this problem. And if we can't get Bishop Eaton, we'll move on without it. While Pastor Jason is doing that, I'll kind of let you know, at your table, we are going to ask you to write down some of the thoughts that you hear. So if you can find a volunteer at your table to be the recorder. They don't have to have beautiful handwriting because we're not going to hang these up on display. But it's helpful if it's legible because I will be collecting these afterwards. Because the believe it or not, the ELCA wants to hear what you think and what you have to say. So that's why we're doing this. So if you can find a recorder, just when we get ready. If that doesn't work, we can just go on to the questions slide. That's fine. Okay, let's just go on to the questions, and that's fine.
The advantage of my doing it is
That's right.
she can
Actually, if you want to see the video, and I was going to ask you, or suggest that you go there anyway, if you want to know more about this process, go to the ELCA website, www.elca.org, and there's a banner, you'll find it easily, and you'll be able to see Bishop Eaton and see the video. So.
Kidding, got it.
Oh, never mind. Okay. Oh, by the way, this is the new magazine publication. Those of you that have been subscribing to the Lutheran magazine, it's now in its new form. It's called Living Lutheran. A lot of the same format, but it's kind of exciting. I think the first issue just came out or is just coming out. Okay, well, this is what the website looks like, in case you've never been there. Also, the Southeastern Minnesota Synod has its own website. I encourage you to go there and look. You've met, many of you have heard from our Director of Communications, Emily Carson, who is an amazing gift to the Synod. Emily's an ordained pastor. She served in Stewartville before she came to work in the office of the bishop. She's our communications director, and she's wonderful. There are all sorts of things you can sign up for there. You can sign up to be on an email, an e-list. You can, if you're on Facebook, we have a Facebook page. But there's lots of great information on the Synod website as well. Okay, never mind. Let's just go to the discussion questions yet. So, this morning you have an opportunity to participate, and we're asking for your feedback about a few key questions that are part of this Called Forward Together process. And I'm going to ask, because there's a limited amount of time, I'm going to ask that each kind of table group just consider one of these questions for this morning. So let's have these three tables on this side. If you would look at that very first question, what important things should our church do in the future, in our community and in the world? And if you would just put a number 1 on your paper, so when I go to collect them. And then we're going to ask, let's have the 3 tables on the outside row over there by the cupboards. If you would look at question 2, which is kind of a two-parter, what are the 2 biggest challenges facing the church right now, and how can we address these issues and move the church forward? So if you put a number 2 on your paper. And then those 2 tables in the middle and the group that's nicely organized there in the back, if you would think about this question, who would you like to see joining our congregations, and how can we make this happen? Okay, that's your question. Now let me tell you, we're only going to have maybe 5 or 10 minutes to do this. So we're not looking to just solve the issue in the next 5 or 10 minutes, but just jot down some thoughts that come to your mind. And then we'd like you to, we may ask you to kind of just quickly summarize. I'll be collecting all these, and hopefully we'll be able to maybe put them together in a way that makes it a little more formal. So mostly these are conversation starters. We don't expect to solve this problem here in the next 5 or 10 minutes. But whatever kind of pops off your head that you think would be important to put down, please do that and please share that. So, go to it. Thanks for being part of the conversation. Then we'll come back together and kind of do some summary work together too.
Brainstorm on challenges and what we should do in the future.
How do you address that? Which I would say is perceived relevance. Perceived relevance. Yeah, what he was saying. Relevant, yeah. So, one of the things he said, young people are having to make difficult choices. What is this going to make a difference in my life? What is I don't have to do something. It's just going to be boxed into Sunday morning and just touch base. That's what I saw my parents doing, so just doing it, it doesn't provide value. so I think that the relevance of the church in current culture is the answer to all of them. It's the following competition,
Competition with
what's that?
competition.
Well, that's an issue, right?
Crassly.
Yeah.
I think attracting youth youth and
Wonderful.
We're still the last generation joins in our organizations are increasingly challenged.
Changing values of society. Where they used to, for instance, conservative Norwegian churches seem to Nancy way back. St. Olaf had a course in Square One's considered St. Olaf.
At cards. Card game. Drinking.
Yeah,
It's changing.
those are changing and our big church. Well, that's right, and we're going to continue to change.
I think she's just pointing out that things used to be significantly different. Change occurred. Things changes occurring now. It's a different change that's happening. But it's still the value. Dancing is okay. Playing cards is okay. Going to movies is okay. Again, you use your judgment. All of it.
I was just, you're on.
Gentlemen, we need a judge here.
Briefly mention this. The value of Christian faith. Studies show, for example, that unaffiliated people have as much altruism in their daily life as Christians seem to.
Right, right.
So what are we going to contribute? Well, that's a real relevance question. And I think, well, we should. But I think that some of these things that are challenges are, being the ELCA is a good example because it was a ghetto for Germans and for Swedes and Swedish and different synods that were really derived from their country heritage. And there was a nurturing of our group versus the other group that was laughing at Sweden versus so there was this cultural box, this is us, that's them, that we've allowed to be nourished over the years because it's what causes the sheep to get traded, because you were born and raised amongst that group, so we are in that group, so we can trade with you when you come to town. But that's a very close box because people don't grow up with that.
I really think where we're going to go as Lutherans is we're going to become
And what what the world sees is evangelicals out there being what's in Christ, which means this is who we are, not you, Muslims, not, it's box building. And I think that the culture is going to eventually reject the box building. So I would give for, wouldn't make any sense.
We'll give about one more minute to wrap up your
Our
conversation.
history is box building rather than welcome Bridgman. His wing.
There's an interesting study about evangelicals versus mainline Christians.
You're talking box builders, I think. In the earlier 70s, 50s, 40s, they would come over from countries so they can congregate in one area.
Other organizations,
Travel wasn't much, but nowadays
that's what part of
travel
it is,
easier.
create their own organizations. And they get invites because, and it's just,
Kind of breaking the box down.
Makes things right more original.
It's the box is truly and really broken.
But you know, it's so different. I have one of my therapy coaches on Tuesday morning with a retired doc, and we had talked about that too. What are you? What's your cultural background? You go from German, Norwegian, what else? Lithuanian, Northern European. There's that. But I don't think our kids do that any longer. The further you are later, it tends to be more American. You don't take an initiative of being an initiative of being Jewish.
So how are y'all doing? You got all the answers. We have solved all the world's problems. I am so glad to hear that. So we want to just hear a little bit from each table. If you have an idea or a point maybe. How about, was it these three tables that did question one? Someone want to share what important things should the church be doing in the future in our community and the world? What was one idea? Feeding our sheep. Say a little bit more about that.
So, whether it be our congregation, neighborhood communities, or just the world in general, how do we bring the message to those areas? The things we talked about, just the general spirituality of our congregation, or in our neighborhood, things we're doing, like open table, bringing people in, trying to be inclusive.
That would require us to tell people about our faith. Are you being that radical, Rich?
There's an old Lutheran in me.
Yeah. That's awesome. Absolutely. How about another table? This one or that one? One idea? One idea? Got a whole table of teachers up here and none of them will say anything.
Well, kind of similar to what the other table was saying, unconditionally.
Yeah, this table talked about, one of the maybe distinguishing characteristics of the Lutheran faith is that we serve our neighbor, we love our neighbor with no strings attached. That's what grace is, right? And perhaps, one of the perceptions that society has of Christians is that, yeah, if we stick the carrot out there, they'll follow, but we have to get them in. There's some coercion, but that's not a way in which we practice our sharing of faith. So people need to know that. People need to hear that, right? That there are no strings attached, that grace is a gift from God, freely given. And that if we are distributing food through Open Table, or if we're working with a hospital in Tanzania, or if we're just showing up at our neighbor's house to watch their kids because their mother died or something, it's not that there's any expectation of anything in return that we serve. Yeah. How about the second question? What are two of the biggest challenges facing the church right now, and how can we address that issue? Who answered that question? Over there. Okay. Tell us what you got.
Well, one was that we live in a time, in our mailbox, there are dozens of appeals from good causes, and you donate to one and you get another dozen. Somehow we've got to figure what What is it that we are offering people in the church that deserves their dollars? And somehow that's a critical issue that we've got to work on.
Yeah. So funding the ministries. This is really what Ann was talking about. I think money, whether there's an abundance of it or there's a massive deficit of it, always causes us to ask questions, right, about what we're going to do. And
there are infinitely more appeals that are coming.
Yeah. Yeah, if you couldn't hear, Dwayne said, you give a donation to one organization and you get 12 more solicitations the next week, right? Because that's how our mail system works these days. And so, one, how is it that we discern what we give to? And two, how does the church figure out how to compete? Is that fair to say within that landscape? How do we clarify our message and share that message so clearly that people want to be part of it and be contributors to it, participants in it? Yeah.
How do you get to the top of the Google list?
How do you get to the top of the Google list? That's why we have a communications director. Yeah. How about others? Other challenges? Yeah, Sue.
We identified declining membership as one of the major challenges facing the Lutheran Church. We're aging out, as has been said. They're not coming from Sweden anymore. And so finding a way to appeal to younger people, appeal to the broader culture, and looking at the fact that people are less likely to join organizations. The millennials are very skeptical of suits.
Right, yeah. One of the articles that's on the back table back there was the article that quotes the 1,000 less volunteer hours. It's actually about the participation in mega churches, and how people appreciate that because there are more people, but there are looser affiliations, looser ties, and there isn't the same level of required dedication to that organization. And I think that speaks to that. Yeah, certainly, yeah. Any other big challenge that we want to address? Nancy.
We talked about many of those same things that have already been mentioned, and we decided that the two we could lump them into. One was relevance, and the second was inclusiveness. Somehow they could absorb many of the other issues that were raised.
Yeah. Relevance and inclusiveness, yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the questions in this, in the internet age, that we have to figure out is, to whom are we going to be relevant? Because there is no universal relevance anymore, because we all have different, preaching has become a whole lot more difficult in the internet age because there are not the same shared cultural stories or cultural references. 20 years ago I could have mentioned Ferris Bueller's Day Off, and everyone would have gone, oh yeah, Bueller, right? But you can't do that with a movie anymore because the narrow casting of and the tight marketing to such small subgroups of people is such that we don't share the same narratives. Roger.
Well, I just say that we could challenge that a little bit if we look at our Roman Catholic brothers and sisters and say, does the Pope sound relevant suddenly? And he's speaking to universal considerations that the Church has very strong positions on, but his predecessors, and most of us on the Protestant side, have not been willing to get out and ring the bell for, even though it's clearly in line with the gospel. So that's the kind of relevance I think we were talking about at our table.
Okay.
That there are universals.
Yeah.
And they hit everybody, and they're much bigger than Ferris Bueller. Everybody wakes up in the morning and say, how am I going to vote? What does this really mean? What about Syrian refugees? What about big issues that no one can avoid?
Right.
And there's a way to be relevant.
Yeah.
And
certainly.
You just have to be scared about how many people you're going to offend in the congregation by being relevant. That's the problem.
Or not be afraid. Yeah.
Right.
And
there's not much future if we go it alone. We have to figure out how do we join hands with others, not only Lutherans, but years ago we had great efforts ecumenically. That seems to have waned. What can we learn from churches in Europe that have gone through this decline 100, 200 years ago? Have they found any answers? Or can we go to the African churches that are alive and excited? Can they start teaching us?
Yes. Yes and yes. I mean, I think if we continue to do the same thing that we've always done, we will look like the church in Europe, where 3% of the population is worshiping on a Sunday morning, right? Right now, it's probably about 17% that's in worship on any given Sunday. Self-reporting is about 35. Because they think that their grandmothers are listening or something. Maybe beyond the grave, but if you look at worship attendance numbers across any Sunday, but you're right, and I think that there have been great efforts. I think that's where, and that's maybe one of the relevant pieces too, is where the main line, maybe out of desperation and out of necessity, we have really come together. We've said, okay, our 300, 400-year-old theological differences really don't matter because we're trying to serve the same people. We have, our congregations have the same passion to serve the same kind of interests, and so let's join forces together. And I think certainly in the last 20 years, the voice of the main line, although declining significantly, is probably much more unified, and the young adults that I talk to and that have been joining and participating here at Zumbro over the last few years have said, yeah, this is a breath of fresh air. I mean, we certainly have a number of what I call evangelical refugees, and so there's some hope. Now I think if we turn and look to Africa, we're going to learn some really significant things as well, and South America, and perhaps that's why the Pope sounds so relevant. He's the first Pope in forever that is from outside of Europe, right? So yeah, we need to wrap up. Well, let's hear just a couple things from the third question group. Who would you like to see joining our congregation, and how are we going to make it happen? You give me the answers to this, and I will bypass my sabbatical, and we'll get right on. Rich won't let me, nor will Pastor Vern. But
a lot has already been covered by the other groups, but we came up with young people and families because of the aging out of the church population. It'd be nice if we could have less falling away from the church, which seems to happen post-confirmation for every generation. And more diversity, both ethnic, social, economic. And how to accomplish this? Sort of Lutheran evangelism, by example and also by direct invitation. Welcoming and accepting people for who they are and where they are in life, and inclusiveness, which everybody has mentioned.
Yeah. Let me just wrap up, kind of to piggyback on much of what has been said here. Let me just tell a quick story about a church that my friend Jody started. She and I were youth directors together on the east side of St. Paul in the eastern suburbs, and then went to seminary about the same time, and she and her husband lived in a house off of West 7th in St. Paul, if you're familiar with the Twin Cities. And it's kind of an arts community. Her husband's an artist, he had a musician, and she's kind of a hippie. She's got dreadlocks and is totally cool. But anyway, somewhere through her second or third year of seminary, she realized that none of her neighbors went to church. And all these people were her friends. And so she went to the bishop and said, Bishop Rognes, I'd like to start a church, like right now, because I'm already gathering people and I want to do it in my neighborhood. Will you support me? And I'm not ordained yet. I'll get there. And I don't expect you to, be self-sufficient in 3 to 5 years, which is kind of the marker for the ELCA, is that congregations grow 3 to 5 years, and we'll figure it out, she said. And so she started inviting people and showing up, and and basically let this church kind of co-create itself. You know, she didn't come in with church programs from the ELCA. Right now, they worship in a Jewish retirement center. And the most beautiful thing is that the office administrator at the Jewish retirement center came to Jody the other before Easter and said, Pastor Jody, I just want to let you know, I ordered palms for Palm Sunday because I know this is a really big deal for you, and I figured you wouldn't get around to it. Sometimes they have 25 in worship, even 5-6 years later. Sometimes they have 125. During the summer, they don't worship. They worship in a park, and they do Wild Wednesdays. And kids and families show up, and they create art together, and they bless each other, and they do really weird stuff. And then they go to the bar, and they sing beer and hymns. And this has become church for a whole bunch of people who would never, well, I mean, they would never show up in church. Now, she wears a collar every Sunday. She wears a collar to beer and hymns. You know, sure, she has dreadlocks, but she's about as orthodox theologically Lutheran as you could get. So she's found a way to capture the essence of our gospel that we proclaim as Lutherans, but put a whole different kind of structure around it, a whole different, you know, set of clothing around it. And it's not going to be a mega church, you know. She's still half-time as a pastor. Her husband is building a bakery and delivers bread by bicycle. They are totally hippies. He actually sings a song about, he recorded a song for his kids about how your parents might be hippies. But anyway, that's just one, I mean, it's just one glimpse of how one community is trying to take a look at what's going on and realizing that something is emerging here, you know? This is within the ELCA. They're doing this within a denominational structure. The ELCA is supporting them. And as a church that is not going to ever be brand new again, we're 150 years old. We have tradition, and we have history, and we have a lot of resources and customs that are important to us. But part of this is how do we continue to bless and to reform and re-emerge and reimagine what it is to be the church for the future. Not only for us, but for our kids and our grandkids, and for all of my friends who don't go to church either. Well, the only friends that go to church are friends that I have that happen to have a clergy person in it. Otherwise, not a whole lot of my friends are going to church every Sunday either. So this is as important to me as it is to all of you, but we'll figure it out together, and we'll continue the conversation, we'll continue to explore. We're way over time. Thank you so much. Oh, and you got it.
Oh, that's okay. I just wanted one closing piece, and if you have to get up and go to church, I certainly do that. But I did put a few handouts on the back about the upcoming Synod Assembly. Zumbro, because of our size, we have a number of voting members that we can have at the Assembly, and it would be very sad if we didn't use all of those spots for voting members. Kind of the overview, there's a one-page overview I put in the back. Please feel free to take that. Please do consider being a voting member at Synod Assembly. It's an amazing opportunity. We have some wonderful speakers planned. You'll be able to hear more about this conversation. Thanks for being part of it this morning, even though it was a short time. I hope these conversations will continue in your small groups and in your circles, in your men's coffee groups, whatever connection you have with other Zumbro folks. Please continue this conversation, and please leave your notes for me because I do want to gather this up. So thanks so much for being here.
Yes.